Yeah, I was thinking we can switch for a while.
Let people sit
Why are
down.
there all these reserved seats there?
I don't know what their reserved seats are about. They're reserved for women. I haven't shown.
Are they-
Yeah, come on.
yeah, nobody. This is
Is this,
nothing's reserved. Nothing
yeah,
should be reserved.
Wendy,
No.
is this on the record? This is on the record, right? Yeah, because, right?
Yes, I think so.
I think so, right.
I think you should assume
Right,
so.
right.
Yeah, people should come up front. This is bad. Right?
They're coming. Okay. If you would, please take your seats. If you would, please take your seats. Good evening. I'm David Gergen, and I'm here as part of the Center for Public Leadership. But more importantly, I'm here to talk with our two gentlemen who are visiting this afternoon. I apologize to you in advance that we don't have a woman, that we don't have actually three women up here. Pierre Trudeau, I'm very impressed with this. He never goes on a panel unless it's gender balanced.
Justin Trudeau, I hope.
Justin, I mean, yeah. Well, he takes after his dad in a lot of
I
ways.
think Churchill would have liked
That
it.
was
He
the
would have liked it.
So, in any event, I just learned I was supposed to introduce these two gentlemen. I just want to say one thing about them. They're two of the most interesting people in the world, and we're lucky to have them. They have both. Nicolas Berggruen heads up an institute. He is someone who's thought deeply about culture and science, about bringing civilizations together, and he's been acting on that in recent years and creating all sorts of institutions that are trying to build bridges among us. And has lived both overseas and here. He's currently living in California. He's building an institute, which is going to be out, for those of you who know Los Angeles, out by the Getty Museum. It's going to be in those hills. It's going to be a beautiful place. And all of us are looking forward to the day that it opens. But he also has a deep interest in art, has had all his life, wants to leave behind a legacy of culture and art. And he can talk to you, he'll tell you more about that. But I think as you listen to him, you realize why I say he's one of the most interesting people in the world. His partner and friend and intellectual partner as well, Nathan Gardels. I've known Nathan going all the way back to the days of Jerry Brown's first term as governor. He was the muse for Jerry Brown and was the thought leader for Jerry Brown. Jerry Brown turned out to be one of the most interesting political figures in this country in the last 30 years. And Nathan was right there in the middle of that and created a publication, New Perspectives Quarterly, when he came out, and has now, for those of you who have not seen it, may I urge you to read the World Post, to sign up for it on your iPad. And you get a weekly roundup on Saturday morning of international thought on a particular subject. It's really woven together well, and it's a precursor for a magazine that Nathan's going to be editing that will be an online magazine that will be coming out soon. So they have written a book called Renovating Democracy. It is short, it is accessible, and it's important. And we're going to ask Nathan to give us a skeletal overview of the book. Then I'm going to talk to them for a little while, and then we're going to open it up to your questions. But it'll be a great day. Thank you both for coming.
Thanks, David. I think we first met in California, actually. We had lunch with Carlos Salinas before he was president of Mexico. So coming from California, we are gripped, like everyone else in this room, by the whole impeachment drama. But coming from California, we have the advantage of being able to take the long view and the structural view of things that are going on in democracy. Yesterday we were at University of Pennsylvania, and I saw some graffiti in front of the House of Letters, or the literature house, that said, "Drama often obscures the issues." So rather than talk about the drama, I want to talk about the issues
Yeah.
that we see, the structural issues. Let me just start by reading the third paragraph of the introduction to the book, just to kind of situate what I'm going to say. Donald, can you hear me? Yeah. Donald Trump's election and the populist surge in Europe did not cause the crisis of governance. They are symptoms of the decay of democratic institutions across the West that, captured by the organized special interest of an insider establishment, have failed to address the dislocations of globalization and the disruptions of technological change. To add danger to decay, so it's a double whammy that we're facing, the fevered partisans of populism are throwing out the baby with the bathwater, assaulting the very integrity of institutions, institutional checks and balances that guarantee the survival of republics. The revolt against the moribund political class has transmuted into revolt against democratic governance itself. Because neither the stakeholders of the waning status quo nor the upstarts of populism have offered any effective, systemic solutions to what ails the West, protracted polarization and paralysis has set in. So that's kind of where we are today. So in the book, the way we set the frame for our thinking is the following, just to give you a skeletal outline of the main points of the book, and then we can delve into each one of them and ask questions about it. But the frame that we set is that the rise of populism in the West, the rise of China in the East, and the spread of social media everywhere is prompting a rethinking of how democratic systems work or how they don't work. Globalization and digital capitalism have created new classes of winners and losers that the old social contract is not configured to deal with. China comes into the picture because it challenges the dysfunctional democracies of the West to get beyond polarization and paralysis and reach a governing consensus by other than illiberal means, or risk falling into second-class status on the world stage. As we see today, and we've seen a long time, and everyone in this room knows, we have a leader of the free world, so to speak, who relishes battling his way through every 24-hour news cycle by hurling barbed tweets at sundry foes. China's leader, meanwhile, has used his enormous power to lay out a roadmap for the next 30 years on everything from artificial intelligence to a new Silk Road trading route. So in the book, we offer several responses to these challenges. The 3 Ps: participation without populism, redistribution instead of redistribution of wealth only, and positive nationalism. The first point is participation without populism. Since social networks have drawn more players into the political fray than ever before, never has the need been greater for the counterbalance of impartial practices and institutions to sort out the cacophony of voices, the welter of conflicting interests, and the deluge of contested information. To mend the breach of distrust between the institutions of self-government and the public, we argue for a form of citizen engagement we call participation without populism that would integrate social networks and more direct democracy into the system through new mediating institutions that complement representative government. We can talk in the question and answer period what this might be. There's deliberative citizens assemblies, there's policy juries. In California, where we have the Citizens Ballot Initiative, it's a second reading by the legislature. But to give one concrete example, if such public institutions of deliberation had been in place before the Brexit referendum, and all the consequences we all now know were aired, the outcome would have likely been quite different. Predistribution. The innovations of digital capitalism are steadily disruptive and increasingly divorcing employment and income from productivity growth and wealth creation. Any social contract that responds to this dynamic must protect workers instead of jobs, for example, universal benefits that are portable among workplaces, and foster an ownership share by all in the wealth generated by the robots that are displacing gainful employment. The aim is to enhance the skills and assets of the less well-off in the first place, predistribution, instead of only distributing the wealth of others after the fact. We call this universal basic capital. The idea is not just to break up concentration from the top, but to build wealth from below. The most effective way to fight inequality in the digital age is to spread the equity around. Final point, positive nationalism. in order to harness globalization, we call for rolling back or dialing back one-size-fits-all hyperglobalization through allowing for, let's call them post-industrial policies that build national economies, while embracing the values of an inclusive society instead of nationalistic incantation, but understanding that open societies require defined borders if the social contract is to be binding. Positive nationalism is not in contradiction to global cooperation, it's the precondition for it. Final point altogether, we have a long section in the book on China. I know you want to talk about authoritarian states. It's based upon our meetings over the recent years with Xi Jinping and others in the Chinese leadership. We're meeting him again later this month.
You guys meet with him once a year or so?
Every 16 months or so,
Yeah.
So, and others in the leadership. And our assessment is that conflict with China is as inexorable as cooperation is imperative. Conflict because of the race for technological dominance. Information technology, especially AI, is not just another factor of production like machine tools. It's about the flow of information, it's about expression, it's about the use of data. Cooperation because of global warming. So to that end, we argue for a partnership of rivals around climate action. If there is not some area of common intent around a convergent interest like global warming, all else will dwell in the shadow of distrust. We're heading to a new Cold War, we're already headed there, and the breakup of the world into geopolitical blocks once again. The US and China may well survive the decoupling of their economies from each other, but the world won't survive the decoupling of the climate fates of the two largest carbon emitters on the planet. So participation without populism, predistribution, positive nationalism. Our concern is that if we don't follow a path along that course, the West is positioning itself on the wrong side of history.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Thank you. That was very, very helpful. I'd like to ask you guys, I want to go back to the participatory side of this and walk through this. Would you want to jump in here?
It's a pleasure.
So here's I'm really curious about this. The participatory institutions and that sort of thing. That is very familiar here to the conservative movement, which for a long time argued that what we needed was mediating institutions in our society that a civil society depends on. You can't just have the government and then the people. It's really important to have civic associations, to have local and state government, to have churches and other forms of religion, where people can sort out these issues without having to rely upon some God in Washington or gods in Washington. And is that essentially what you're proposing here, for starters?
Short answer is yes, but the question is, what is the form?
Yes.
And if you think about what has worked in democracies, let's say over the last 50 years,
Right.
You used to have, in essence, an editor, which were political parties, traditional political parties. You used to have traditional media,
Right.
and then
They were
you had
mediating
government.
instruments, yeah.
And now, today, well, traditional media has lost its his grip on people. And traditional political parties or have been hijacked or have basically gotten destroyed in Europe, in essence. So who replaces that?
Right.
And you need a replacement. Otherwise you have chaos. Pretty much all across democracies right now, you have chaos. So what we are proposing is that people want participation. They can get participation because of technology.
Right.
They want a voice. And the question is, how do you federate those voices?
Right.
And what we are proposing is that you have potentially referendums, but you have informed referendums. And how do you do that? You put together citizens groups, a little bit like juries, that will look at different issues and then recommend what to do to citizens, to the legislature, and to government, so that you have, in essence, the editor that's missing.
That sounds very similar to what you did in California, what you personally got involved with the long-term thinking group in California. Can you describe that?
So, Kari, two things. California is already, sort of almost post-party democracy. Frankly, in California, you have now one party to start with, and number two, you've had referendums that have been the key to shaping policy in California for a long time. So anything really major gets decided by the public. Highly politicized, highly gamed, and therefore the question is, how do you depoliticize it? How do you make it more open for citizens? So we've created at the Institute a bipartisan group called Think Long Committee for California.
Say it one more time. Think what?
Think Long Committee for California.
Think Long Committee.
So
California.
this was actually a name that one of the committee members, George Shultz, Republican, came up with, and it included him, but it included people on both sides, 14 eminent Democrats and Republicans, to come up with ideas. And one of the key things was to change the referendum system itself, which got done, and change other things in California to make the state more functional. We've started this. It'll take decades.
Yeah, but you got some things done.
We did.
And you had some political reforms that came out of that, of California.
Yes.
Came out from a citizens'
And
commission.
we would argue that what you can do at the state level,
Right.
you can't do today at the federal level. But California, being an important state, will have an influence over other states and over what happens ultimately in Washington. And frankly, we find that California is a laboratory for democracy, meaning reforms, but also for capitalism, because it's, as other places in America, highly unequal. So you have to rethink.
So there are people who believe that 15, 20 years ago that California had too many referendums. They were not, they were decided by a lot of money spent on lobbying and on television and one thing and another, and they got California into a real mess. Among other things, people voted for more and more spending and less taxation, and surprise, and California wound up with huge budget deficits. But what you've suggested is a mediating institution, a group in between the citizens before they get to vote in the ballot box.
And one of the things we achieved so far, but more has to be done, is we made the referendum system more deliberative, more open. So in the past, I don't want to bore everybody with incredible details, but in the past, if you, let's say, submitted a referendum, you couldn't change it, you couldn't even withdraw it. Now you propose it, there's a period of time when you can deliberate it, when you can actually negotiate with the legislature to amend it, or the legislature can propose something that will, frankly, do away with your proposal. So it's much more dynamic. And we're proposing the next step is to actually have deliberative bodies that will look at the pros and cons, unintended consequences of each one of these bills, and make recommendations.
Pre-distribution. Is that very similar to what Cory Booker has been proposing? You give everybody $1,000 at birth for a child as a way to have cash from the bottom up and support people from the bottom up.
Yeah, let me just add one thing on the initiative process, though. The point about direct democracy is not that we didn't start saying let's have direct democracy. We started from the point that California had direct democracy, which both did the terrible things that you mentioned. It locked in revenues, locked in spending, and locked out revenues. There were initiatives against same-sex marriage, initiatives against immigrants. Because there was no mediation either by the legislature, a second reading, or by citizen bodies themselves in a nonpartisan setting. So that's the kind of thing that we think needs to happen for all direct democracy, because it's the trend around the world. In Italy, Five-Star Movement came to power with the slogan, participate, don't delegate. The referendum, obviously, in Brexit and so on. On pre-distribution, the point really is that, you're talking about Cory Booker's baby bonds.
Right.
Cory Booker's baby bonds. Yes and no. That was an idea of Jefferson, by the way, originally, of Thomas Jefferson, that in order to eliminate inequality among generations and hereditary wealth, that everyone should have basically a baby bond when they were born. That was a Thomas Jefferson idea.
Richard Nixon believed in
Oh, that's interesting. This idea is like that in the sense, but I want to make a distinction. What we're talking about, that is a kind of a form of a universal basic income. Our idea of universal basic capital is quite different, is that because of the nature of the digital economy going forward, the source of wealth and productivity is intellectual property. And that intellectual property is going to create enormous wealth, but it's going to displace labor and reduce and depress wages. So people will no longer be able to rely just on salaries and on income for a living. And if you read the Piketty book on inequality, obviously the big gap is between those who own wealth and those who only own labor. So the idea is those who don't own wealth need to get wealth, get equity. But they need equity in the IP, they need equity in the robots of the future if it's going to make a difference in inequality. Baby bonds are a great idea, but then you have your baby bond and that's it. You're not earning more wealth, you're not developing wealth, you're not making a living off of a return from investment, you're making a living off of a transfer of wealth from somewhere. So there is a distinction in what we're talking about, and it's specifically linked to the future of the digital economy.
I mean, I can give you an example, concrete example. So today, redistribution is done through taxes. It's going to become more toxic, not less, not just in America, pretty much everywhere, including in China, by the way, because inequality is increasing. So the idea is get everyone, including the state, sort of in the same boat. So make everybody an owner. How do you do this? In a very practical way, simple way, it's just an example, is let's say David starts a business. As opposed to owning 100% of the business, you would own, let's say, 80% of the business. If you're successful, you're going to be successful anyway. You're going to be happy, the business is going to be very prosperous. 20% goes to society in a fund that's for everyone. And what it does, and with technology, you can attribute to everyone who's here and everyone who's not here a share of your business. So if your business becomes Google, everybody becomes a participant in that business. Everyone is successful if your business is successful, and everybody shares in the upside, including the state.
You keep 80%.
You keep 80%.
And you
Capitalist keeps
you
whatever.
pay taxes on the 80%?
You'd have to make a negotiation on taxes. You can't have taxes plus. So, for example, one country has done it, not in name, but in fact, Singapore. Singapore has a sovereign wealth fund that owns a piece of most things that are productive there. In exchange of that, they're able to fund a budget that funds all the services, which are incredibly high in Singapore, and the taxes are much lower because the sovereign wealth fund has benefited so much from the wealth that's being created from the productive
Was
assets.
this under Lee Kuan Yew?
Yes,
Yeah.
I mean, it's been the same all along.
Nicolas, we talked downstairs a little bit about capitalism and the challenges now coming against the capitalistic system. Where are we going on that? Where are we heading?
I think inequality is increasing, and I think, as Nathan mentioned, IP is becoming more and more valuable. Labor is relatively less valuable. Capital is less valuable. So, take the example of Google. Google was created with $25 million. That's it. So you can create enormous value, enormous utility with not that much capital, not that many people. So how do you empower everyone? Well, you have to share it.
Does that also mean the Business Roundtable CEOs recently signed up to some fanfare, a statement that the business was no longer, that only had one stakeholder, and that is the shareholders, and only had one purpose, it had multiple shareholders. And they appear to be, several of the CEOs appear to be taking it pretty seriously. Is that the kind of reform you think is necessary over time?
I think there's no choice.
Can it be done voluntarily?
I think there's no choice. Unless you have everybody participating in the future, then people are not going to take it. So after a while, you're going to have something that's much more inclusive. And so, I mean, people are going to have to take a lead but they have to do it not just with words, but with reforms.
Right. I'm wondering if there's a darker way to look at where we are now and what the predominant forces are. You talked about a competing for technological dominance. But are we not also in a world where we're competing with China for geopolitical dominance? And I would ask you both, are we also in a world in which people are seeking within their individual societies both cultural dominance, demographic dominance, that groups that are the most powerful now see their power slipping away, especially as their societies become more multi-ethnic. And I ask you, we talked about this as well, can a multi-ethnic society succeed as a democracy? We are facing a situation increasingly in this country where you see white people holding back, resisting, because they're fearful that they're losing power. And we're becoming a multi-ethnic society in which they're going to feel increasingly marginalized.
I think that's the case both at home, meaning within domestic environments, and internationally. I mean, internationally is the very obvious one. The West has dominated.
Right.
So this is the first time that you have real competition from a totally different culture and political system, meaning China. And that's never happened to the West. I mean, there was a time when the Soviet Union was considered a threat, but in truth, it was, a little closer culturally to the West. Here, China, very different culture, different political system, but very real. I think, and this is my own very sort of personal theory, which is that, the Western culture is monotheist by background, and the idea of accepting sort of two gods, two truths, being alive at the same time is very hard. And for us in the West to accept China, we have to sort of accept that somebody else has a totally different way of functioning and is equally legitimate. Very hard. So I think that's on the international stage. And I think at home, you're right. I mean, this country has been dominated by one group. That domination is receding. You can see it from, this group. I think that's good, but it's very hard if you give, giving up power, giving up, it's difficult. The transition is going to be fought. I think that's human nature, but at the same time, that transition has to happen for us to be healthy. We had a little discussion before. I'd love to get from the audience their feeling which democracies have actually been successful multi-ethnic democracies. I would argue America has been actually reasonably successful, but it's fraying now. I think Brazil.
That's because we're not truly multi-ethnic yet either.
Well,
we have one dominant group that has remained dominant throughout our
but
history.
no longer,
Yeah.
and I think a minority soon. And you've had difficulties, but you haven't had. The system still has held. The question is, will it hold?
Right.
Brazil has actually managed through ups and downs, but it's worked there. I mean, but it's a question.
Right.
And
I've got to answer on the China issue. I think I don't believe that if you listen to the Chinese leaders and people around the Chinese leadership, they argue they don't want to supplant the American-led world order. They benefited the most from it, and I think there's some truth to that. I think that the danger comes from the first issue we were talking about, which is the demise of democracy. Things don't happen in a vacuum. Graham Allison, obviously people here know Graham, who talks about the Thucydides trap, conflict between the rising power and diminishing power causes conflict. But also Joe Nye from around here says, well, there's also another reason that there's conflict, which is when those who provided the public goods retreat from the scene, global public goods, and no one's there to replace it. It creates a vacuum, and it's in that vacuum that new dominations take place. As the West deteriorates, in its own polarization and paralysis and doesn't get its act together, like I said at the beginning, in finding a way to reach a governing consensus by other than illiberal means, it's handing the situation over to those who manage to, through authoritarian means or other, maintain a governing consensus and move forward. You know, things don't stop because we're having impeachment. You know, things move forward. And just on the multicultural point, I just want to make one thing. I would argue that California is successful. But it's only success because we are now a majority minority state. Most population is Latino and Asian. As we point out in the introduction to the book, California kind of went through already back in the 90s what the whole country's going through now with Trump and the immigration thing. We had big battles over immigration. We had citizen initiatives against immigrants. Now a majority-minority state, we've moved beyond that situation where the question is, okay, how do people get upward mobility? Because if you have upward mobility and you have opportunity, that's a condition for successful multicultural societies. So the funding of the state university system, the public school system, there's some big challenges there. But Cal State LA, just to give one example, Cal State LA is the #1 school in the country. It's a public university. #1 school in the country for lifting people from the bottom 20% to the top 20% through education. So if those things aren't in place, a multicultural society, multi-ethnic society is not going to work.
That's a good point.
But it can work if there's a cushion of not even so much prosperity as belief in opportunity. Because if you look at Mexico, the problem, famous Mexican intellectual Carlos Monsiváis always used to say about Mexico, and the font of its corruption and everything else, and its immigration, is when there's no opportunity, everyone becomes an opportunist. And when you have that, there's no going back.
Yeah.
So
Final question. You started by reading a paragraph from your introduction about the fact that Trumpism didn't start with Trump, or that our problems didn't start with Trump. The question I have for you both is, one day Trump is going to leave the office. We'll see when that is. How do we heal after Trump?
Well, I guess what I was trying to suggest when I read that paragraph is the answer is not just getting our own team back in power. There are structural issues that have to be addressed, as we tried to point out in the book. How democratic systems work. Above all, the most important task in democratic systems is to establish, once again, the possibility of impartial institutions. If all institutions in democracy are considered corruptible, there's no way forward. So the first thing to establish is to reestablish that trust between the institutions of self-government and the public. It's not a candidate that's going to do that. It's a series of things. It includes candidates, but it's a series of things like we talked about, engaging citizens and so on and so forth. But that's the most important thing structurally. And then we have to deal, as we pointed out, also with these inequality and distribution issues. I think my fear is the agenda after Trump will be exactly that. It'll be a reaction to Trump. And we will have from the right wing left behind to the left wing left behind with equally extreme...
People who say they're left behind.
Yeah.
Coming out of that place of anger.
Equally extreme ways to try to fix the system. I mean, there's a lot of, the polarization leads to a lot of let's get our team in power, and that's the main thing. If we still have that, the situation structurally is not going to be all that different from Trump, because we're facing the same problems with China, with the digital capitalism, and with people being alienated from the political process.
So, I mean, if you look at the world, I mean, we're here, so this is the issue. But pretty much every democracy has the same issues. So it's not just an American problem. If it was just an American problem, you could say, oh, well, then it's an issue of leadership. But it's not the case. Most democracies today have some form of crisis. I mean, the democracy that America was derived from, Britain, is facing huge challenges across Europe. Most countries in Europe are unhinged. you go to South America, you go to the few democracies in Asia, they're all pretty challenged right now. And the few that were in theory democratic, like Turkey and Russia, in essence have been hijacked. So you need to go back to Nathan's point, you need to have a deep reform. You need to go back to government as a service organization to be there for all people, not for just the people who've won or who've been elected, so that you have, a never-ending contest, political contest. You, in essence, have to go back to having institutions and government there for everyone.
Mm-hmm. And the international view of America, how is America going to pay a price beyond the days of Trump in office, of people no longer feeling that they can rely upon American leadership, as Merkel, for example, said a few months ago?
Well, the price being paid is the world is paying the price. Yeah. It's not just America. So America is paying the price because the world is less stable and more dangerous and potentially less prosperous. So everybody pays the price. No, there's no question that America, having withdrawn from its role in the world, as Nathan said, creates a vacuum. And the question is, what happens to that vacuum? Well, some are filling it, reluctantly or not, but let's say China and Russia are filling it to some extent. But the reality is that if you have, at a time when you need world cooperation on things like climate and health, and technology is becoming more and more powerful, so you do need cooperation on AI or gene editing. Well, if you don't have it, where do you go? And that's where we are.
Mm-hmm. I have wondered whether at this point it's easy to tell the world that Trump is an aberration and does not represent the long term, nor does it really reflect the short term. I wonder if that equation changes if he's reelected. It's harder to make the argument that he's an aberration.
I don't think, as I was trying to say before, an aberration, it's, I'm going to put it, quantity to quality. After a period of aberration, it's no longer an aberration, because it creates the kind of vacuum I was saying, and I think that already exists. It's interesting to look at how the world, because we don't know how the world will go without American leadership, but we can see, to answer your question, certainly the Europeans have figured out we got to go our own way. Merkel has said it. Ursula von der Leyen, the new chair of the European Commission, Emmanuel Macron of France, he's trying to do his own diplomacy. So they're already trying to go to their way. However, Europe is weakly integrated, so I don't know what that means. But the problem's going to come, again, I go back to technology, the problem is going to come through artificial intelligence. I read an interesting analysis recently by Fu Ying, who was the head of the National People's Congress Foreign Affairs Committee on AI and China and the US. And the two AI powers, artificial intelligence powers, are China and the US. And China in particular, if you talk to Eric Schmidt from Google, is not only catching up with the US, but surpassing the US. Because everyone who goes to China knows you use your smartphone for everything. You get a train, you go to the convenience store, you get money out of the bank, all the information is there AI needs to learn and develop rapidly and quickly. So in her analysis, you see AI and again the censorship and all the things related to it, drawing China away from the US, so you have two technological powers, and both going away from the rest of the world, because Europe is concerned with regulating privacy, the rest of the world is way far behind in connectivity, and China even sees that its cherished relationship with the emerging economies was also going to separate, because China will be on another planet than all the emerging economies. So this world is going to be a completely different world where no one is particularly in control, and there's a battle for technology. So
it feels like we're already there.
Yeah. So the U.S. kind of, as a political player, it kind of sinks out of that picture.
Mm-hmm. Good. Well, this room is encourages sort of more intimate conversation. So we open the floor now. If you'd stand, please, and just give us your name. Start back to back. Yes, please. Give us your name and then identification and fire away. Do we have microphones, by the way?
Thank you for the talk. I'm Kevin. I'm a student at MIT. So present in the sort of discussion was sort of anti-Trumpism. So let me recall the history of the transition from the Keynesian Fordist state into the sort of Reagan-Thatcher era, where McGovern as the sort of left-wing populist within the Democratic Party and also Nixon as the right-wing populist within the Republican Party were denigrated as populists and representing the destruction of democracy. And so now, given that we're far from the birth of Reaganist, Thatcherite neoliberal politics, since we seem to be transitioning into a sort of post-neoliberal politics, the right-wing populist Trump is denigrated as a threat to democracy in a sense that is a sort of a recrudescence of the sort of thing that augured the beginning of the sort of prior era of the past. I was
You
wondering
had
if
a
you
question as well.
I was wondering if you could account for this sort of rhetoric of the destruction of democracy, given that 30 to 40 years ago, democracy wasn't actually destroyed with the transition into the neoliberal era. Thank you.
Okay.
I would say we've had that question before, in essence, which is, I think it was an interview in The Economist. The question was, oh, you guys talk about a crisis democracy because you're liberals and you don't like who got elected. What's the problem? You know, people voted for Trump. The issue is not elections and is not teams in power. The issue that we discuss is the nature and processes, institutions and practices of democratic governance, mainly outside the ballot box. Most of the important things that happen in democracy are outside the ballot box. Deliberation, civic education, compromise, political culture. Those are the things that have deteriorated. We had enormous battles. David remembers he was in the Nixon White House, and I was probably against you. I don't even remember.
Sure you were.
But it was a different story. It wasn't the fabric of democracy. I mean, Nixon had his rule of law thing. We have the similar thing now. But basically, it was an economic battle. Nixon was actually quite centrist in the scheme of things, in terms of the environment, in terms of
He started the Environmental Protection Agency.
So now it's a different story. It's about what's happening outside the ballot box with democratic political culture. That's the challenge. That's the challenge that goes back to the fundamental design of Republican institutions. I think that's the problem. So it's different. I guess I would just, it's different now than it was then.
Let's see, who has the microphone? Do you have a microphone?
Maybe just line up at the next one.
Yeah, I agree with that. Why don't you go back, Sarah, to the microphone, and then we'll go from there. We want to get some more women in this conversation, please.
Hello?
Yeah.
Yes.
Where are you?
I am not pretty convinced that the idea of a basic income, basic capital, whatever you call it, because the idea of wealth is an idea of leverage, meaning that you have more leverage than other people. And I don't see how someone can just sit down, do nothing, and get that kind of leverage with basic income or basic capital, because in your idea of a basic capital, the 20% goes to society. But how then do you redistribute it to society? Do you give it to the poorest people or the average income people? So it gets confusing. I think I'm wondering if it's not a matter of focus. What do we want in society? Do we want everybody to have more wealth? And don't forget, I told you it's about leverage. Or do we want people to have well-being? So I'm wondering if it wouldn't be an issue where we would have to be more radical, where IP should be owned completely by society, and we reward people who are actually making inroads and progress. And also, we make sure that we keep competition going so that there is not one body controlling everything, either business or either government body.
Your question.
So I think it's a matter of degrees. I think your question is good in the sense that you don't want it to be all state, or you don't want it to be all in the hands of entrepreneurs. The idea here is that entrepreneurs still are in charge because that's their job. That's what they do in terms of creating new enterprises and creating ultimately jobs and all that. But as opposed to keeping it all, they share with society as a whole, because it's important to share with society. And the question is, to what degree? And today, you have a sharing that's done through taxes, that's redistribution. And what we propose is to give more capacity from the beginning, sort of the capabilities idea, is that you give a share of these capabilities to everyone from the beginning, as opposed to after the fact. That's the change, and I think it's a very important change in mentality, because it puts everybody in as an owner, so everybody's in the same boat, as opposed to being some people in and some people out. That's really the idea, but it's a matter of degree.
Add really, really quickly, you can read it in the book, because to be very clear, there's a continuum of ways and means to do this pre-distribution idea. Some are conventional ways, like mutual funds in which all invest. So some models of this exist, we talk about in the book, the superannuation fund in Australia, which everyone belongs to, or the Singapore Central Provident Fund, which all citizens belong to, in which they own, or the California Public Employee Retirement System, where they're vested in the markets and people get a return on their capital. That's one way. Another way is platform cooperatives. If everyone here, if in your neighborhood, instead of using Uber and Lyft, if the neighborhood owned the rideshare service and everyone owned a share in that, they would get the payment every time someone took a ride instead of Uber and Lyft, a platform cooperative. There's a place here in Massachusetts, a company, if you share your medical data and a pharmaceutical innovation that developed out of it, you get a royalty. The governor of California has talked about data dividends. There are many ways to get pre-distribution, I guess. So it's not just this one idea. There's a continuum of possibilities.
Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Juan Fernandez, an alum of the College and Business School, and I also work for the Chan family of the Chan School of Public Health. I like the idea of redistributed equity. I think that is central to the issues that we see today. And the question for me, which is a very similar one, is how do we actually do that? But my question to you is there such a thing as American exceptionalism? And will that kick in at some point to help us as everything shakes out on a global level?
David, I think you should answer that question.
Yes, but it much depends on how you define American exceptionalism. It is ordinarily defined in common parlance as American is exceptionally good or exceptionally powerful, but it's something that puts it on a higher plane. I don't think that's the correct way to look at exceptionalism. Rather, it is the question: is America different? And I think America is a different country. There's a sociologist no longer with us named Seymour Martin Lipset, who used to write about this a great deal. And if you look at the American politics, the way the American economy is formed, all sorts of traditions in this country, they are very, very different from Western Europe, especially U.S. and Canada have very, very different traditions. So that the TV shows with violence, you can put them have them shown on the border. And in America, you see a lot of teenage violence from people who've been watching. In Canada, the same things are shown. They don't get the violence. And it has a lot to do with sort of the kind of the culture we've developed. So I do think we're on many different measurements, we are different from. And that very important difference and distinction from better than. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name's Leah Rechtman, and I'm a concurrent student at the Kennedy School here and also at Harvard Divinity School. And this question relates to the ways you talked about religion. I was sitting back here, so I couldn't see exactly who was speaking at a given moment, but there were two things you said. One was about the U.S. and China and how we have a monotheistic culture, and so it's hard for us to conceive of two great powers. And then you said that sort of California got around these issues of multiculturalism and pluralism because it had belief or hope. And so I was wondering, using that religious language, if you could speak to the connection between those two comments, and if you're talking about sort of a paradigmatic shift in our civil religion, and if you could just say more about that.
Interesting question.
Okay, so my comment was not religious in nature. It was more relating to culture. That, our cultures are shaped by, in this case, religion in the West. And if you look at Western cultures, they are shaped by monotheist beliefs. And monotheist beliefs, I mean, a reduction of it, and you will hate me for saying it like that, is simply that, well, you believe in one God and one truth. And for the first time, it's not that we have to believe in another God, but another way of functioning, meaning another version of the truth. Our version of the truth is democracy. And suddenly China is a different version of the truth, meaning a totally different political system and a different culture that so happens to be an old culture. And can we, as Westerners, accept a totally different way of functioning that politically, in every way that we've been brought up, is almost the opposite of ours? And can we accept somebody who is on the other side of the world to be as legitimate as us in terms of important decisions in the world? And can we share, in essence, a lot of what the world is about with such a different culture, in essence, a different religion? And it's a big question. And I think it's to go back to David's question before, which is, if you're dominant, let's say in America, whites were dominant, can you give up? It's very difficult. And if you were the West and you were dominant, can you share? In this case, not give up, but can you share with another way of living? Not easy. And I think that's our challenge. I think it's a civilizational and cultural challenge. And it's a deep one, and it's not a short-term one. It doesn't depend on elections and who's in power today.
We're going to try to get through everyone who's standing. We have about 10 minutes, maybe 12 minutes to go. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Rory Schachter. I teach ethics and politics of technology at MIT, and I'm a research fellow at Harvard. Sir, could I just respond directly to your last comments? You talk about a belief in democracy and China's, I guess, belief in itself. I wonder if that already is not a kind of fundamental and perhaps even dangerous change in thinking. If you think about the Cold War, it was said during the Cold War and at the end of the Cold War that Soviet communism failed because it was against human nature, and that it proved that political freedom and economic and technological development are mutually reinforcing, so that democracy isn't a belief. It's actually empirically the best way forward, even in terms of raw military and political might, regardless of debatable normative standards. And yet I just wonder if, in a way, China's rise doesn't call that into question in a way that even, say, Nazi Germany or the USSR did not. This is a new kind of threat to Western confidence, you could call it.
I think it's a mistake to compare China to Nazi Germany. China has a 2,000-year-long history of institutional civilization and governance. It was the first state, really, politically speaking. It's not the Soviet Union. It has a lot of inner civilizational competence. I mean, I'm not endorsing anything that China does. I'm just saying, kind of to Nicolas's point, it's a long-standing, historically extant civilization, one of the longest continuous civilizations on the planet, maybe the longest. And it's just whatever we may believe about democracy, and we're all opposed to the Uyghur camps, we're all opposed to the crackdown on the Hong Kong protesters. We're not going to change China from the outside. In the section we have on China, we start with a quote from Lee Kuan Yew. It told me probably almost 15 or 20 years ago. China will not be a democracy, and it will not be an honorary member of the West. And the best thing we can do to change China is, go back to the first point I made, is we have to show that democracies can get past polarization and paralysis and reach a governing consensus by other than illiberal means and compete with the Chinese system. It's a complete illusion to think, in fact, it's the opposite. The more you press China, the more hard it will be. You've seen that with the trade war, and that will get worse with the technology, as I mentioned. So I just think that we have to be realistic about China.
Perfect. Yes.
Hi, my name is Chandler Rosenberger. I'm the chair of the International and Global Studies program at Brandeis University. And I wanted to possibly draw some of the comments and questions that have come up together on this point of cultural confidence. Xi Jinping himself has said that this is the signature characteristic of his presidency, that he's going to restore cultural confidence in China. And his speeches are full of references, tying the Communist Party back to this 2,000-year legacy, and that the Chinese should be proud and confident as they go forward with their own system. And so I'm curious about your take on positive nationalism, which you mentioned as one of your Ps. I mean, Xi Jinping has said we can tackle corruption with our Confucian principles. We can tackle our issues from within our culture. And I'm wondering if there are elements of positive nationalism in the United States, in Western European countries, that we could be turning to try to settle these differences. Possibly the civic institutions that David referred to, possibly some kind of broader civic engagement. But I'm wondering if there are ways to restore some positive sense of a common culture that would be important for our own success.
I actually thought of that with the last question from the young woman about civic religion and the exceptionalism issue. I do think America has been exceptional in that sense of the civic religion being in principle well, how can I put it? It is monotheistic culture, but being in principle founded on freedom of religion. Of course, all religions were Protestant religions when that was put together. But the principle of tolerance of different points of view and tied to, importantly, the notion of upward mobility and the notion of opportunity. I mean, those two are kind of like the civic religion. And that's why I said, when I talk about positive nationalism, I said not nationalistic incantation as we're a wounded country and some victim of some kind, but an allegiance to the values of an inclusive society. Now, I think there's limits to that. We talk about in the book about how immigration works, how asylum works, other things. But basically, I think that is the inner confidence of the U.S. But again, it comes back to regain that civic confidence. You've got to get back to the key challenge, which is to reestablish the trust between the institutions of self-government and the public. That institutions are impartial, that they take into account everybody, and that every institution is not corruptible, which has been Donald Trump's message. If we don't get back to that, there's no chance going forward. But to some extent, that is a civic religion, and that's what sustained the United States, I think, and why this moment is so dangerous.
And I think just to say, the positive part of this, which I think is very important, is a very simple idea. I think one can be nationalistic in the sense of being for yourself, but not against others. So, it doesn't have to be negative. It can just be positive.
By the way, just as an ad for the book, there's a long section here on that subject based on an interview with Isaiah Berlin on pluralism and what defending belonging means.
Terrific. Please.
Hi, I'm Isaac Rose-Berman, a student actually also at Brandeis University. And I'm curious, a lot of your solutions involve getting the people back involved in politics. But I'm curious how you would combat political apathy. You look at places like Seattle, which have taken some of these movements to kind of get people back in democracy with their democracy dollars and giving people money to help them distribute it to candidates, but only 3% of people actually used that money and gave it to candidates. It seems like Americans don't really care that much about politics. How can you really get them back involved?
Good question.
We were just discussing this with Wendy a little earlier. I think most people, like all of us, are busy with family, work, and life, and not all that interested in politics. But to go back to the earlier question, we have always believed, I suppose you'd say, that if we want to have an impact, we have ready agency to do so, whether it's going to the ballot box, or in the case of direct democracy, you have even more ready agency. You can put something on the ballot yourself and go to it. But I think the mediation part and the deliberation part is not going to happen by all citizens somehow studying all the issues all night long and then, you know, taking a notebook to the ballot box. You need these indicative practices institutions like deliberative polling, citizens' assemblies, that are an indicative representation of the public, but not through parties vying for power, but citizens sitting down trying to figure out in a depoliticized, non-electoral context what the issues are and how to reach a consensus. I'll just give one example. Over the last couple of days or over the last couple of weeks, some of our colleagues, Jim Fishkin and Larry Diamond from Stanford, held a meeting in Dallas with 582 citizens from all across the country that represented age, gender, and everything of the whole country. To bring them together in a context where you're not on CNN versus Fox, but you're sitting there at a table with fact-based evidence, looking at the Iranian nuclear deal, looking at immigration issues, and saying, you know, what works here and what doesn't. And you'll see there's an article in the Upshot in the New York Times from yesterday, October 2nd. You can read this. They have the pictures of all the people. Many people moved their positions. Oh, now I understand what the other side is saying. Or even if they didn't move their positions, they no longer regard someone with a different point of view as an enemy and realize we can have a culture of compromise. So I think those kind of institutions, rather than giving up because people are apathetic, people will be involved when it matters to them. The important thing is that the institutions and the agency that enables them to participate are seen as impartial and taking into account everyone's point of view in a fair way.
But it goes back to, I think, what we talked about earlier, which is that it's true. I think that most people don't have the time and won't want to engage or don't, whatever, for whatever reasons. But they need somebody to listen to. And it used to be, you know, a newspaper or, you know, somebody on TV, or used to be a political party, or used to be, we talked about it, the League of Women Voters, or, you know, an organization. And if these are no longer the ones, you need new ones. And the question is, what are these new ones? And for example, what was just done was this sort of citizens assembly. That may be a new version or modern version of it. So we need to reinvent these editors because they need it.
The turnout this next year may be much bigger than you think. Please.
Maybe take one final question.
Yeah, we have one. I'd like to make sure we have one. We'll take these two questions. You go ahead and ask, you ask, and then they'll answer both. Okay.
I'm Christopher Fry. I've worked at MIT, like a few other people in the room, for most of my career. The last 2 years I've taught a class called Why Can't We All Just Get Along? With a colleague. I was born in LA, and I know where the phrase came from. I've also been a roboticist and AI guy in my career. So we taught about all of the issues that have been covered here today, including your excellent analysis and your quite good solutions. And I like to say to the audience, all three of you are gems. You're sharing your wisdom with the world is exactly what we need right now. So I really appreciate what you're doing here today, your book, and the World Post.
There must be a butt in here somewhere.
Okay, so I like the idea of this redistribution of wealth. I like the idea of AI and manufacturing. I want to take it to the next level. So here's where I think AI and manufacturing is going. I think it's going to give us all personal factories. That means advanced printers that can make clothes and food and glasses and computers. And we will be able to individually make the things that we need to have a comfortable lifestyle. If we have this, we will solve scarcity. We will solve issues of inequality, nationalism, and a lot of government problems as well, although that's a longer argument. So I just want to say, you're doing the right thing. Let's keep going. I want to join forces with you. And with a little bit of technology, we can make much faster advances than is going to be possible by pushing the political issues with UBI or UBC.
Okay, yes, ma'am.
Thank you. My name is Maria Marta. I'm a first-year student here. My question is more related to how do we go about these changes? Because I worked in the presidency of the Dominican Republic for 4 years, and I know institutions tend to be sticky in the sense that it's not something that you have structural changes happening frequently. So are these types of transformations, do they happen from within governments, or is it something that society and citizens outside the government have to demand for it to happen?
Both questions.
Okay. Where did you say you're from? Mexico?
Dominican Republic.
Dominican Republic, yeah. Well, I think the history of all reform has been social movements that arise usually after technological changes or economic crisis or both. And so I think there'd be demand from the outside. What we talk about in the book, because there's such frustration at the federal level, we think it comes, well, in any case, it'll come from the bottom up. I think not from the top down. So in the book, we trace the history of American, in the case of the United States, of American institutional innovation in governance. It always happened in the States. Before the Constitution in 1789 came as a result of the experiment of democracy, or not democracy, excuse me, of the republic, of constitutional writing in the years after independence. John Adams in North Carolina Provincial Congress first talked about a bicameral legislature for the US and so on. Later on, 100 years later, the progressive movement also arose in the States. The whole idea of direct democracy, which we have in California and 27 states in the US have, came out of the States. What also came out of the States in those days was the idea of, the progressive movement was the idea of smart government. Instead of having cronies run the cities, they had city managers and professionals. So you had both direct democracy and smart government. Both of those came from the States, from the bottom up, where there was a real need to get beyond the corrupt legislatures, to get out behind the cronies that were running things, and let the people have a say. What we just try to do in the book, our changes that we're talking about on the Democratic side especially, we think will also come from the States. We talk about a third term. The first term, the Founding Fathers focused on deliberative mechanisms that we've been discussing. They had representative government, they had independent courts, institutions between the people and power. The progressive movement, in response to recession and technological change, industrial revolution, had their ideas, direct democracy and smart government. Our idea of the third turn is to mix smart government and direct democracy with the deliberative filter that the Founding Fathers focused on, because we're in a new environment of this participatory power of social media and the digital age. So that will come from the bottom up. So in the case of Dominican or any place else, I think it comes from the people that are closest to the ground and feel the pressures the most on the economic as well as the democratic side. Many cities around the world, by the way, have citizen initiatives or participatory budgeting, because it's right at that level where they can see things and they can do things, and then it bubbles up.
Thank you.
One of you needs to address the question of the cornucopia that's going to come from AI.
So I think this is my, it's a two-edged sword. I think technology has helped a lot and will continue to help a lot. So I think that we are lucky that, you know, especially where we are here, with all the great talent, you know, Harvard, at MIT, and other universities around here that create all the things that you know, improve our lives. I think it's incredibly powerful, and it has helped the world. I mean, the world from all around, certainly China, India, every place is better off today than it was 30 years ago, in great part thanks to technology. But is the world, you know, less messier politically? Are the political tensions lower than they were 30 years ago? I would argue today actually not, almost the opposite. So technology is very helpful in terms of, you know, helping us humans. But if we don't have the systems and the culture to manage, you know, us as, you know, humans with each other, The technology just makes weapons even more powerful. Look at what nuclear is. We managed. Great. AI is the next one. So these are going to be enablers. But if we don't know how to manage ourselves, no good. So we need both sides.
Gentlemen, thank you for living up to your advanced billing. It's terrific. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. We're going to talk now?
Yeah,
Before we go?
if you don't mind.
Okay, good. Yeah, yeah.